Hola, bona tarda. Benvingudes, benvinguts a un nou Interferències, avui sobre la pràctica del disseny a través de les cures o les cures en les pràctiques del disseny. La xerrada d'avui serà en anglès, ara de seguida passaré a l'anglès per poder-los donar la benvinguda als convidats i introduir breument la sessió. Tot i això, ja sabeu que com sempre a la part del final farem una mica, obrirem el debat, a qui vulgui comentar, participar, preguntar, el que sigui. Si algú no es veu en cor o no se sent còmode fer-ho en anglès, ho podeu fer en català, castellà i entre totes ja traduirem o ja ens apanyarem, ja que són poquetes, també així més en petit comitè i amb confiança, que ningú es talli, si us plau. So, thank you all for being here, especially you two. They came from really far away today. And well, welcome especially to a new Interferències on design as care practice. In recent years, the number of collectives, institutional spaces, designers and researchers who have been focusing their work on understanding and proposing ways of articulating art and design with the practices and ethics of care has grown. And this is opening very interesting debates and also challenges. Caring implies designing strategies and practices to maintain, contain and repair the world in which we live. It implies to learn collectively to sustain complex links between humans and more than human world. This becomes increasingly urgent, of course, in a situation that is marked by the climate crisis, pandemics, political polarization, social and personal conflicts, and those do not stop growing. This leads to understanding the environmental as well as the affective and emotional consequences of design practices, to think in more than human timescales as well, to explore and develop new forms of kinships and ways of being in the world. So this is why the following talk will provide a context, or will attempt to provide a context and a space to go deep into some of these questions and debating the possibilities of blending care and design practices. We will have the participation of Laurene Vaughan, Professor of Design, Researcher and Dean of the RMIT School of Design, and Brad Haylock, a designer, theorist and Associate Professor of Design at the RMIT. After the presentations, as I said before, we will open the debate. Please don't hesitate to just ask or comment wherever you need or you wish to. So thank you.
Super, thank you. Thank you so much for having us here this evening. Laurene is going to speak first, but before we begin, I'd like to say thank you to Bao for having us here this evening. It's wonderful to be back here in person after a few years of not being able to visit during the pandemic, so it's super nice to be here. We're a long way from home today, but I would like to acknowledge that we work on the unceded lands of the people of the Woiwurrung and Boonwurrung language groups of the Eastern Kulin Nations, and on behalf of RMIT I would like to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and indeed to recognise and pay respects to the traditional custodians and their ancestors of all lands and waters upon and across which we conduct the business of RMIT University.
Thank you. And thank you also for having us here this evening and for this opportunity to share some thoughts with you about design and care and how we think about it as a practice, and in many ways the acknowledgement of country, which is what Brad was just saying, which in an Australian context is when we acknowledge that we are on lands of the traditional owners, and that in itself is a way of deepening our understanding of care and when we think about how and where we design. So today what I'm wanting to talk about or share with you are some thoughts from two different projects that have informed my thinking about care and design. And I'll take the microphone out of my pocket because that might mean I stop knocking it. So the first of those projects is well, I don't know, actually, it's probably the second, is a book that I edited called Designing Cultures of Care. And it's an edited collection of case studies of different approaches to thinking about care and different approaches to design in that context. And so it features case studies of projects of people from around the world. A number of them are in the aged care sector. Many of them are informed by social design, but not all. And then the second project that I'm going to reflect upon is a project known as Design for Wellbeing. It was a 3-year research project where myself and 4 other researchers were contracted to do a post-occupancy design evaluation of a psychiatric unit in a hospital. So the original facility for the hospital was made up of 3 different wards that catered to 3 different contexts of care within the hospital. Geriatric for elderly, dementia patients, acute care, and then chronic, people who were actually in psychiatric care probably for life. And so the hospital was being rebuilt, and for the first time was bringing the psychiatric units into the main body of the hospital, which ended up looking something more like this. And we were brought in to really analyse how the design works. So the first year of the research project involved us being in the old facilities, spending time with patients, with carers, with other service providers, asking them about how they experienced the space, how they experienced care, what the facilities and hospital environment was like. We then, at the end of that year, they moved into the new facility, and we left them alone for 1 year. And then after 1 year, we went back in and interviewed them. And in that, we wanted to understand how they understood the new facility. But we wanted them to be settled so we could have a conversation that wasn't one of excitement or longing. So these two projects are going to inform what I'm talking about. And working in psychiatric context is really interesting because it really highlights care in a very different way than I have ever experienced in any other sort of thoughts about care and environments. And so this is the World Health Organization's definition, which I'm just getting to so that I can actually see it. Mental health so the World Health defines mental health as a state of well-being in which every individual realises their own potential, copes with stress of life, works productively and fruitfully, and is able to make a contribution to his or her community. Which is a very interesting frame to then try and design a medical context of care. So I'll talk about that a bit more. So design and care, or designing and caring, if we're going to be doing things, it's a mixture of nouns and verbs, of things and actions, of dispositions and propositions, in the singular and in the collective. On first encounter, it seems so simple or straightforward. We shall design with care. Or it is in or through care that we will design outcomes of meaning and connectivity. But as we explore more deeply and consider each of the elements alone and together, complexity becomes apparent, and you realise that this statement is both an invitation and a declaration of how we might design, why we will design, and the value of this designing in the present and in the future. As many will know, over the past 10 to 15 years, there's been a shift in how we understand and articulate design and its capacity to contribute to the world that we manifest or destroy. Through contemporary discourses and movements in sustainable design, human-centred design, participatory methods, co-design, and the possibilities of connectivity through digital technologies, definitions of design as a problem-solving, materials-orientated suite of professions have and continue to be challenged. With this, some have argued that design as a socio-technical domain of practice, or that it is that, and which leads us potentially in the right direction for expanding our thinking about design. Such critiques capture the links between social and cultural aspects of design, whilst retaining a focus on the material practices that are, for the most part, the basis for design practice. At the same time, we have also seen the rise of design thinking as a particular articulation of design and its application to organisational or business contexts in particular. Fundamental to this transformation in how we define design has been the has been the evolution of new domains or contexts for design practice. These have been realised in areas such as service design, social innovation, and urban planning. Digital technologies and the rapid increase in the digital things of our everyday lives, which have, through our proximity to our bodies and the pervasiveness in our private lives, have the capacity to make the most intimate aspects of us public, all with the click of a button. All this has transformed what we may think or how we will define what design is. Bad use of pages. So up here I've endeavoured to list for you some ideas of what design can be. The closer we are to the subject of care, the greater the social and cultural expectation that care will take place. This, of course, includes self-care. As we move through this discussion tonight, I propose that there are practices and cultures or contexts of care that are framed by the following dimensions: the dynamic and relational context of the care, the proximity of the subject of care to the carer, the motivation for care, and the levels of free choice and other driving forces that catalyse the care, and the sense of burden or ease that the carer feels about the expectations of care by others and by their own conscience. So what I am speaking about today, I'm very much informed by the ethics by care ethics and the work of Maurice Hamilton in particular. Care is often positioned in relation to empathy. And over recent years, we have seen a significant body of work across a range of fields, including design, looking at the ways that empathy might change the way we practice and contribute to the well-being or worthwhile design outcomes. This is strongly linked to human-centred design and sustainability agendas in particular. But is empathy enough? It is possible to perceive of empathy as being passive. Some would say that empathy is about having compassion. of endeavouring to walk in the shoes of another. But of course, we can't do that. It's not possible to walk in the shoes of another. Hamilton states in his article that caring actions or performances are the result of the workings of a moral imagination that both empathises and favourably anticipates making a difference. Empathy participates in the moral imagination and is a catalyst for action, but it's not a sufficient condition of it. How we create the conditions that lead us to want to respond to others in a caring manner is the challenge of establishing a practice of care. These are what he calls imaginings. Imagination, in the sense of his work, is best understood as the link between who I am and what I know of the other, but more importantly, how I relate to the other so I can care about the situation in a manner in order to act. I feel like I'm shooting at you, Brett. So Hamilton goes on to use Victor Vroom's expectancy theory to make the case that care is the active state of being and thereby able to impact or enable change. Expectancy theory quite simply argues that humans act when they feel that their actions will have some form of impact. Put simply, for example, I will give money to a charity if I think my giving will result in actions or values for others. For designers in the practice of care, that is a significant difference. And that's a very long big text, but I thought I'd give you lots of words. Caring is in an ethically meaningful sense, is not merely a sentiment, but describes a collection of actions tied to disposition and linked to identity. Caring is actualised through performance. Caregivers must do something for others. Caring integrates a disposition of openness and positive intentions with a performance of actions that lead to the flourishing of the one cared for. Positive iterations of care, although making further caring actions easier, do not make them automatic. Expectations of our effectively being able to care still play a role in our decision. So, says Hamilton. So, which brings me back to the hospital project. Here's some shots from the interior of the old hospital. It was, as you can see, a bit tired, a bit worn out, and you could say, if you didn't inhabit it, a bit sad. The new hospital interiors look like this. They're much more modern, they're slick, their colours, they reflect a time that we live in now. And what we were doing in the project was trying to understand what the intention of the designers and the architects and the landscape designers were in realising this outcome and how it related to the patients, the carers and other service providers who are there. And what is interesting is that if you don't know, and I didn't know prior to doing this project, is that a model of care is what actually drives the design brief for a hospital or any other care facility. And in that, it has a particular proposition of what care will look like in that context. And so, in this case, it is an observational model of care that was put together. So this was one where it was you could see in all directions at all times, which might be panopticon, but it's actually not as central as a nursing station in the middle of a ward with lots of beds around it, but very similar. And it's on this here again is a quote from Hamilton, where he says, "Caring design is a human-centered innovation and problem-solving methodology or process, as well as a moral and an epistemological ideal grounded in a commitment to inquiry, empathy, and care of constituent stakeholders." And all this I found to be useful in thinking through this project. But one of the things about Hamilton is that he sees design as being a very human-centered practice area, which when we start to think on a broader scale about care and urban environments is a little bit speciesist. But he also sees it as being one of problem solving, which I think, as he is a non-designer, and I think that that's something I would also, contest, that much of what we're talking about here is hopefully expanding and not just problem solving. So design as a practice of care is an approach to innovation and the realisation of design interventions that have a moral and an epistemological ideal. And I think that's what I held on to and thinking about in this project, going back to this one here. And I'm going to leave here the outcome of the project, a report, which is actually a set of cards where we endeavoured to make summaries of what some of the key findings were from the various stakeholders in the project. And what was interesting was that this term homeliness came up consistently from the residents, the patients, and from the caregivers, that they were looking for something that would actually feel homely and feel that they could feel connected to. And what they didn't feel was that the new environment provided this. There was a longing for something that had been inhabited by others. The kind of newness of coming in didn't feel to have the social connection. And what you realise too in this is how important how people feel about the space is, not necessarily the actual literal design features. In the design of a hospital unit, one of the most important things I learnt in a psychiatric unit are ligature points. Places where people can hang themselves. And the entire space is designed to ensure that that won't happen. Windows are down so low that it would not be possible. Doors will fall off at 7 kilos if you put a weight on them. There's just all of these things are built into the design, which are actually things which are literally about life-saving care. And yet the actual residents are worried about whether or not they feel at home. These are just some of the findings I'm going to just talk to now. Sound was one as well. The role of sound, acoustic design in space. Something I think is often potentially quite overlooked in designing environments unless you happen to actually work in that domain. But the sound of a clicking door handle, much like the one in the room tonight, that click going on was one of the largest points of complaint, especially for the people in the rooms near the click. But the reason the click is there is so that you know the door is shut. And so there's all these constant paradoxes, I suppose, was what kept coming to realisation. And then what was interesting, and I think this is a new area that would not have been so much in the original hospital's narrative, was the idea of service provision and service design. Because often when you're thinking about hospitals, you're thinking about patients going in as a patient and being discharged. And there are many ways that people come into a psychiatric unit, by choice or not. And they may leave, they may be able to come and go. But what is that service provision for people as they move through the different points of contact? One in a service design we might call the customer journey. That in itself was one of the areas that was raised as being a concern. And finally, this, and I just thought I'll just give you an idea, I won't talk all the way through it, but these are part of what's in the box and also on the website are recommendations for future buildings and hospitals. And talking about technologies and the introduction of technologies and how that relates to a human thing, because now the food is delivered by robots as opposed to a lady with a trolley as it had been in the past. And so these elements of how we think about technologies for safety, for service provision, and always finding the balance between, I suppose, economies of costings, care, well-being, and connectivity within a very broad and diverse community group. So this project actually provided a very insightful way that was we used design ethnography methods to do the actual evaluation, but to think about how care in its most broadest context could actually, how it plays out, and how with the best intentions, the idea of practicing design into that care modality, and still there will be foibles, there will be challenges, but it's definitely, yeah. So please, I will share with you, and if anyone's interested, there is a website and you can see all the cards and see all the report there. So with that, no, it's okay, it's for you. You can pass it around if you like, but maybe it might be different to what Brad's going to speak about. So thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Laurene. My slides are not all quite this austere, but I'm also a typographer, so hence austere slides. Thanks, Laurene. So this short talk from me this evening is adapted from a chapter I wrote titled Picture Education Today from the book we saw earlier on screen, Designing Cultures of Care, which Laurene edited. In that chapter and in this talk, I discuss data visualization as a critical practice and situate it in relation to discourse on care ethics by identifying care as a bedrock of critique. In the published chapter, I discuss 3 sets of data visualization projects that respectively map networks of power in US business and politics, visualise sentencing data from the state of Victoria, Australia, where we're from, and communicate the shape of Victoria's public film collection. Due to time constraints tonight, I won't discuss those case studies today, so if you'd like to know more about those examples, I'd invite you to read the chapter. But today instead I'll focus on what I understand to be some of the theoretical dimensions of design as a practice of critique and care, synthesising some material from that chapter with some of my other thinking on design as a critical practice. Data visualization is just one kind of design practice that can do critical work, but it is, I think, a good way into the discussion, and so it's again my starting point today. Against the background of a post-Marxist political framework, I'll seek to unpack the ways in which data visualization might be understood as a counter-hegemonic practice, that is, a process of unmasking and of promoting pluralism within a broader democratic project. My own theoretical affiliation lies specifically with the understanding of hegemony proposed by Ernesto Laclau and Chantal Mouffe, to which they bring a Lacanian inflection, and also Mouffe's later writings on agonism. Since the operations of unmasking and of making knowledge more public, which we see in data visualization, have historical and practical overlaps with education, I also draw on writings on critical pedagogy, and I look to discourses on care ethics because I understand this as an ethical framework that complements theories of agonism. Still good. Data visualization has a rich history as a type of communication design practice that renders visible social realities and bodies of knowledge that might otherwise remain imperceptible. In the second quarter of the 20th century, Otto and Marie Neurath led a team that developed the Vienna method of pictorial statistics, a system better known now as isotype, which is an acronym derived from its later name, the International System of Typographic Picture Education. From its inception, this work was intended to meet educational needs. The Vienna method was intended to inform the Viennese public about their city, and later isotype sought to take that program to an international audience. The isotype system was conceived to improve the teaching and learning of difficult material, particularly the introduction of complex matters such as social organisation and history. Our experience, Neurath wrote, is that the effect of pictures is frequently greater than the effect of words, especially at the first stage of getting knowledge. The goal of isotype was not an education system concerned with bettering the best, but rather with improving the situation of the majority. This social agenda for the betterment of education systems has parallels, of course, with Paulo Freire's conception of critical pedagogy, which entails meeting learners on their own terms and which holds the emancipatory potential of education as a key tenet. Education can produce a critical consciousness, Freire argued, one that allows one to go a step beyond the deception of palliative solutions and to engage in an authentic transformation of reality. It might be said that the unmasking of systems and processes of subjugation through data visualization equips citizens with the insights and resources necessary to begin to embark upon the transformation of their own realities. These insights and intellectual resources might also be described as anti-subordination knowledge, which is a term I quite like from Latin American critical legal studies. Whilst we might aspire to rise to Freire's challenge to confront, to listen, to see the world unveiled, how might we prepare ourselves for the enormity of this task, and what is our moral obligation to act upon what we might find? In other words, as Chantal Mouffe has asked, which ethics for democracy? And here we might look to the ethics of care, also known as care ethics, a strand of moral philosophy, as Laurene has noted, which has its roots in feminist discourse. Care ethics mobilises a series of critiques of the sovereign individual at the centre of contractualist ethical frameworks and emphasises instead the interconnectedness of persons, complete with dependencies and needs. One of the key thinkers in the field of care ethics, Nell Noddings, distinguishes between caring for and caring about. Caring for, in Noddings' formulation, refers to a direct interpersonal care for those with whom one has a close relationship, such as one's children or family, while caring about is a care for others with whom one does not have a direct connection. A later thinker in this lineage, Michael Sloat, has described Noddings' categories of caring for and caring about as, respectively, personal caring and humanitarian caring. Or, in other words, again, these categories can be respectively understood as a concern for those near and dear and as a concern for those distant and unknown others. Sloat also draws upon the theme of empathy to question the scope of care ethics. He argues that caring about, and I quote, can be understood broadly to take in not merely animals, fetuses and people, but also ideas and ideals. It is not at all clear, though, that the latter are appropriate objects of moral concern, he says, and certainly it is difficult to make sense of empathy with abstract objects. Sloat concludes that the question of empathy in relation to ideas and ideals is too difficult a task and limits his own project to discussing care and empathy directed at or responsive to people or groups of people. And I would ask, does this mean that caring about ideals such as democracy or justice is beyond the scope of an ethics of care? And of course, what about the more than human world? Perhaps it will come as no surprise that I would like to argue that ideas and ideals and the more than human are within the remit of an ethics of care, not least because of their implications for others, however far removed across time and space those people might be. If one cares about the ideals of democracy and justice, surely this is because one cares about all of those people who might benefit from the actualisation of these ideals. And here again, Noddings is helpful. While she holds that there is no adequate substitute for caring for, i.e. direct caring, she also acknowledges that intelligent, conscientious caring about can suggest ways to extend caring for to many more recipients. And of course, I would suggest this care can extend to other than human actors. As anyone will tell you who has ever had a cherished pet, cat or dog or other animal, empathy for non-humans can be felt perhaps just as strongly as empathy for other people. And care for the natural environment too is straightforward enough from a care ethics standpoint. The sustainment of ecosystems that themselves sustain life is clearly an act of caring about current and future life of all types. In summary, care ethics emphasises relationality and interdependency by foregrounding the importance of care for others near and far in moral decision making. Between the poles of, on the one hand, a universal moral subject, a move toward what Chantal Mouffe would describe as the impossible reabsorption of alterity into oneness, or on the other hand, subjects atomised beyond any possibility of reconciliation. An ethics of care allows us to imagine bonds between divided subjects without entailing a reduction of differences. And so I would like now to return to the question of design and data visualization as critical practices. Data visualization can be a powerful tool for the unmasking of power relations in abstract or complex systems and for the sharing of anti-subordination knowledge of other types. But if we are to understand design as a practice of critique and care, it also needs to be said that this operation of unmasking is necessary but insufficient. Design, broadly understood, is well placed to be a critical practice when it also works to make possible futures legible, or perhaps more specifically, better, when it works to make preferred futures legible. And indeed, perhaps it is only a critical practice when it does this. And so I'd like now to share some further thoughts on this topic. And I'd look firstly to Mouffe's thinking on art as a counter-hegemonic practice. Drawing upon the work of Richard Noble, Mouffe identifies 4 types of critical art. 1, art that directly engages with political reality. 2, art that explores marginal, othered or oppressed subjectivities. 3, art that interrogates its own conditions of production and display, which we would know as institutional critique. And 4, art as utopian experimentation, or attempts to imagine alternative ways of living. Design, too, can function in each of these ways. Nothing is lost if we read design for art in each of the above. But it is the 4th of these categories that is the most important here, I would suggest, since design is particularly well placed to be a practice of utopian experimentation. To understand the significance of this 4th category, I look to the work of Ernst Bloch in the domain of ideology critique. Bloch argued that we must look beyond a partial, superficial form of enlightenment. As Douglas Kellner has summarised, Bloch distinguishes half enlightenment or partial enlightenment from genuine enlightenment. According to Bloch's analysis, ideology critique should be not merely an exposition and denunciation of mechanisms of mystification. Here I quote Kellner on Bloch. Bloch would dismiss a merely denunciatory approach to ideology critique as half enlightenment, which he compares to genuine enlightenment. Half enlightenment has nothing but an attitude, i.e., rationalistic dismissal of all mystification, superstition, legend, and so on. Half enlightenment deludes itself by thinking that truth and enlightenment can be obtained solely by eliminating error rather than offering something positive and attractive. As compared to other critical practices that might be characterised as mere half enlightenment, design has the potential to offer important and impactful forms of critical practice because it is well placed to not only reject how things are now as being the only possibility, but also to offer something positive and attractive. We do this whenever we, as designers, imagine possible future worlds and make these legible to others by giving them material form in some way. Theory can, of course, do this with words, but recall Otto Neurath, who argued that the effect of pictures is frequently greater than the effect of words. Needless to say, not only images, but also artefacts and other forms of material expression are the repertoire that design disciplines can bring to the task of critique and therefore care. In other words, design benefits from the heritage of critique in general, which offers up a vast repertoire of techniques of unveiling, but design is particularly well placed to render preferable futures thinkable. In closing, I would like to emphasise that it is essential for us to consider the legibility of our operations of unmasking, not only from a user-centred point of view, but also from a diverse, pluralistic and participatory point of view. The objective of the Isotype project to create a universal visual language for the rapid communication of complex information is noble, but of course we know now, the better part of a century on, that such universalism is dangerous in other ways. And so we need to aspire to the empowerment of communities not only through practices of unmasking or unveiling, but also through co-creative approaches across all stages of problem formulation, analysis and interpretation, and futuring. In other words, we must work not only to unmask the current state of the situation in cooperation with those who would benefit from such anti-subordination knowledge, but we must also tackle the co-creation of preferred futures with these stakeholder groups. And this is well known in some areas of design, such as the Scandinavian tradition of participatory design, but we still have much work to do to incorporate these principles into design practices more broadly and elsewhere, and I would suggest too into design education. And there is still much work to be done to understand how other than human actors might be better represented in co-creative processes. Without all of this work, we risk simply replacing one regime of subjugation with another, however good our intentions might be. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Maybe we can open the debate. I don't know if there's anyone willing to ask something or comment something. I have many questions myself, so maybe I can start while you think a little bit. Okay, I have to pick one, I guess. One of them is maybe in a practical sense, thinking on design in practice. What happens when we have to deal with different conceptions or opposing conceptions of what care is. Sometimes they might be contradictory, and one might need a kind of care that might be even, I don't know, problematic or even violent for somebody else, and we have to kind of solve them all or give an answer to them. I don't know if this has happened in some of the projects that you talk about in the book or that you have been working with, and if this has happened, how did you solve it, or if you have an idea of how could we do that. I don't know if I was clear enough with them.
Yeah. Well, it's in a psychiatric unit that's very evident, because it's interesting that there are 4, 5 different units of care within this one, and it's on the second floor of a hospital too. It's not on the ground, which is also another thing that adds a kind of uncertainty. So there was a parent and child unit. There was a aged dementia unit. There was a acute care and chronic. So people who are there for a long time, people who have some sort of ill health, and then people who are so unwell that they are in secluded rooms. And it's austere. It's everything that the movies have shown us, and then what we expect it to be. And yet you also know it's for, well, the proposition of care is to save life, which is possibly the real ethical challenge, and one that is very much in the medical domain, and that as designers we don't necessarily have face, and yet we would, in some ways, we contribute to that problematic, and that's the really hairy, difficult ethical questions of, what value life and what kind of life. Typically we would say human life above other forms of life. And in the last little while, I can't remember where I heard this conversation, but it was with First Nations Australian people, talking about how human-centeredness makes no sense to them because there is no differentiation between environment, animals and people. So to prioritize, you cannot prioritize people and destroy land, because do that and people will die too. So it's understanding the interconnectivity. But yeah, I think that these are some of the really challenging. But there was definitely what I was confronted with in terms of being in this project and going into places that were mythological in some ways. So yeah.
My response would be a methodological one, that I think that the challenge is equipping designers with some tools, and no tool will ever be the right tool, but some tools to seek a working consensus between competing understandings of what care is. So, but also understanding that there will be no one right resolution, that any consensus will be held in common only for a period of time, and that the work of finding consensus is necessarily ongoing, but might be that shared understandings might be held in common sufficiently long enough for progress forward to be made, but that it needs to be continuing work to understand what care would mean for given stakeholder groups over time.
I understand. Well, I guess that this ongoing work is really important in this kind of care practices. But I think, at least from here in Spain, most of the projects, they have very limited time scope, so they have to end, either because we have a limited money, or because there's a client that wants it to happen once, or because it's, even if it's an academic project still. So I don't know how if we have the chances, or if you have found other ways of still continuing or following up with the projects to really make it happen like in this way, right? I mean, to make it adjustable during time, and to really, for example, take advantage of these interviews that you did in the hospital after 1 year, and that this turns into something else and not just like dilutes.
That's what that's why we were commissioned to do the research. So the research that we did, and the official, there's a very big report, and then there are the cards and the website. They were then being used for a new hospital. And I know that the findings have been used for about 2 or 3 different hospitals through people I know who've been using them. So that an idea of building a sort of reflective practice, or that's why to do this post-occupancy in built environments is quite normal. And I think we do a certain amount of that, but I don't know that we always, I suppose you only know what the questions you ask. And so if you are evaluating digitally things, and you only want to know if people can use them in a certain way, you'll only know what you ask. And so I think that that's perhaps one of the real challenges, and for us as educators and researchers, is actually helping people to work out what questions to ask so that we can actually do that ongoing work is part of this, because you can ask the question to prove, to make sure you're right. But that is not the, I suppose, in order to, I suppose we are at a point where design is being asked, or as designers we are obliged to think beyond just the production, the impact. This is where the impact of the work and its potential, as well as what Brad was talking about, in terms of how we design into preferred futures, however we might define those.
Staying with this idea of preferred futures, a question for Brad. Well, thank you so much for both. Contributions have been so great, and so many questions in my mind, but I'll stick to one each. Sticking to this idea of preferred futures. In a lot of care theory, and looking at care theory, and from a post-humanist perspective, there's a lot of debate about decentering the human, and how you get the human out of the way to start acknowledging, seeing, listening to other non-human entities that are involved. And when we go back to the practice, design practice, and we start talking about preferred futures and imagined futures, suddenly the designer comes back as a very central figure that somehow is a savior of a future. And it seems to regain agency as who can think for the others what is a preferred future. How can we deal with this sort of somehow contradiction of we're trying to decenter the human, but design still needs this designer through a collective or through a participatory project, but there's still this idea of we can envisage a future that's desirable for everybody else, and displacing again all these other agents from the conversation. So how can we relate from a post-humanist idea, the centering the human, if the human comes at the center back again? That would be my first question. And then from your contribution, Laurene, there's a strong sense that as you're describing design, it's lost its role as a entity of communication or information displaying, and it's going to a meaning, making meaning, or a sense-making sort of practice. And you talked about meaning a lot, which is very nice, but it's a massive movement, and how you produce meaning is a very sort of deep and interesting question. So I wanted to pick your brain on that idea of design as a sense-making or meaning-making practice.
I think what I'm really interested in design as a practice of care is that care is a disposition that you bring to practice. So it's so it is having a more thoughtful, reflective, or systemic understanding of what it is, to that there is an impact of what you do, good and bad. And I think design and designers can no longer hide behind beauty or function, either of them. Because many will be quick to say that design's caused the problems of the world, or we've done our fair share, more than it. And so I think that's really what I'm talking to when I'm proposing, is that it's actually understanding that there is this interconnectivity and that it's multi-species. It is actually more than just, here's a brief, solve a problem, deliver a thing. And that what was interesting in doing the hospital project is that we came in after the design. So we were retrofitting, trying to make sense of what, against ambitions as to what realised to go forward. And so, which is really very different to how I've ever thought about doing anything. But yeah, so that's really the proposition, is that it's how you approach the practice. So as much as anything, it's about the practice and the ongoing pursuit of the practice in that respect. Yeah. Do you remember number one?
Yeah. I was also going to use the word disposition and reflexivity, because the paradox you're pointing to between the proposal on the one hand that we might centre design and design practices because we think they can do good things in the face of what might be called wicked problems. Well, this is probably a good idea. But then, of course, we run into the question of how we might proceed to decenter ourselves and our methods and receive practices to make space for others, other human voices and other non-human voices, so to speak. So I think that the best thing we can do is move forward with a disposition that acknowledges that paradox and is reflexive at every step, because it can't be readily overcome, but we can at least hopefully avoid future missteps by checking our own work at every stage of the process.
So thanks very much for your inspiring presentations. I have a question that is more related to the design of the hospital, but I think it can be generalized in relation to the idea of what design for care can be. So the question is, if in the project, the initial project of the hospital, there was the idea of appropriation, so design for appropriation by the patients. So the idea of letting them, I don't know, simply decorate their bedrooms, creating their spaces. If it is something that they were doing already, so this idea of care as letting people just be and do, or if it is something that wasn't there and you anyway value as a practice of care.
It was something that existed in the old hospital, and partly because as they knew they were leaving, people did more and more to the space because they knew it was going to be demolished. But there were also they had a tree, a shared knowledge tree, I can't remember what it's called, but they would leave messages for each other, especially if they were leaving. So if somebody had completed their treatment and they were leaving, they would leave a message to other patients, and it was quite a positivity sharing thing. And it was highly valued by the patients and the carers. In the new hospital, they're not allowed to do it. They're not allowed to stick things on windows. This is like any new building. They're not allowed to have these customizations and things. Partly because for some people it looks messy. Sometimes the staff did it to create privacy when the whole model of the design model was one of observation. Everybody is observed, the staff and the patients. But also because the company that does the cleaning doesn't want it there because of the labour it causes for them. And so then we go into a whole other thing about the financial systems that design hospitals. This particular hospital, it's quite large, not huge. It's in a regional town, a small town in country Victoria. It's not in a metropolitan city, it's quite small. The company that funds the design, that hospital, are actually in Germany. So when we had to do our ethics for the project to do the interviews, we had to have them signed off in Germany, as well as at the university and at the hospital and blah, blah. And they contracted the cleaning services. The cleaning services didn't want the stickers. So the patients made a three-dimensional tree that didn't touch anything. There was a workaround, but it was that kind of, yeah. So it was that kind of nothingness, but very meaningful to the people who were there. And I think that's all the argument for vernacular design. And all of that area of work that people do that's looking at different aesthetic models and all of that because of how it relates to those who are either the makers or the users or the community or whatever we want to call it. Yeah. So that was kind of, the tree was a very contested thing. Lots of people spoke a lot about the tree.
We're running out of time, but going back to Brad and your idea of visualization as politics, I was thinking, because you go into the critical tradition in which debunking or explaining or opening information leads to some kind of social transformation. And I was thinking a lot on a debate that happened here in Spain when the Open Knowledge Society Foundation, based in Central Europe, came here with a lot of data about corruption, and thinking we're going to put all this information in the public sphere, looking at very specific regions and the amount of corruption and money laundering and wasting in public organizations. And this is going to be a contribution to a massive change because the audience got all these figures, and it's going to be very clearly visualized by region, by department, by people are going to think, this is our money. There's going to be a reaction. And nothing happened. The amount of corruption is so big, and it's our corruption. So suddenly it felt like, well, you're touching something that belongs to us. So there was no action. And I was thinking about this idea of there does not need to be a correspondence between knowing things and caring about them. And what could be this extra thing that design could bring in which knowing something leads to caring about it? Because we know about lots of things. And there's so many things that we know are happening or could be. But knowing and having a very clear idea, even a very visual idea of what it is, does not push you into action. So this idea of how you become active when you know the information, when you see things in front of you, which is going beyond criticality, and it's something that's not even critical. It's like empathy. We're talking about empathy, or making sure that belongs to you in a way, so much that you want to take care of it. And how could design go into this?
Great question. I think my own home discipline, as you know, is communication design, graphic design. And graphic design has a long history of assuming, a little wrong-headedly, naively, that awareness raising is per se good and per se transformative, neither of which we can assume to be the case. And so I think the example you give of the data about corruption is fantastically interesting. I would propose that the mismatch there was a lack of work done to co-creatively understand the problem. So there was no co-creative problem formulation work done. And if that had been done, then the data team might have not proceeded to even bring this data to public attention, because obviously there's some shared understanding of the state of the situation, which means that this is not the problem locally that some outsider assumed it to be. So there's a mismatch there between one party's understanding of the problem and another stakeholder group's understanding of the problem. If there had been co-creative work done on problem formulation earlier upstream, we might say, to use that design term, if there had been co-creative problem formulation work done upstream, then there would not have been this impasse of someone saying, hey, here's all this data, surely you must care about it.
So I think that maybe if there's no other questions, last call, we can maybe leave it here. Thank you very much again. It was really interesting, and it was very generous of you to share your thoughts and your experiences on this. It will definitely help us think further about our practices. So thank you again.
Thank you.